Hi and welcome to this quick 5-point guide to realism. Now, realism has certainly been around since the very beginning of literature, the desire to copy things as they are. Nevertheless, realism has a particular relationship with the novel. If we look at the very first novels in English in the 18th century, if we look at things like Defoe or Fielding or Richardson, and also if we look at the genres from which the novel emerged when it was still a fresh and upstart genre, things like travel narratives, spiritual autobiographies, crime literature, journalism, what links all these texts together is a demand for the empirical and a demand for veracity. We look at the title pages of these kinds of texts, both fictional and non-fictional, and what they advertise is veracity. We meet time and time again phrasings like a true and authentic account of, or a full and genuine account of, and this shows us that with the rise of the novel comes a certain rise in a brand of realism. Nevertheless, the very high era of realism is associated with the 19th century, and that's the kind of text I really have in mind today. These long, rich Victorian novels with very large casts of characters, huge scope of action, focusing on contemporary or near contemporary settings. So, authors like George Eliot and Charles Dickens in the English tradition, Zola and Balzac in the French, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in the Russian. And I just want to run through 5 points or approaches which I think are invaluable whenever you're thinking about or reading a text of this kind in the classic realist mould, particularly from the 19th century. Number one, empirical detail, and lots of it. Realist novels tend to be quite long, and a lot of this length is taken up by the piling up of details. And many of these details are going to be, to be honest, more or less irrelevant, but that's kind of the trick. Because what the novel is trying to persuade us is that we're not reading a novel, but we're actually immersed in a real world. So what it's trying to mimic is an objective transcription of what there is. It's as if the novel is a kind of scientific lens, which is just recording things without selection. And indeed, a lot of novelists in this tradition did describe their enterprise and their art in slightly scientific or quasi-scientific terms. This lack of selection or this direct transcription of what is also conditions the kind of things that realist novelists would look at. They would tend to look at everyday objects, ordinary situations, ordinary things. George Eliot, for example, explicitly models her fictional practice on the realism of 17th century Flemish and Dutch painting, things like this. It will tend to be humble people engaged in everyday occupations in quite humble surroundings, rather than, say, the idealism and the mystery and so forth of the high art of, say, the Italian painting tradition. And this tendency to look at what might be said called low subjects really draws the realist novel towards certain things. For example, engagements with the condition of the working classes, or with towns, or with industrial conditions. This would be most obviously apparent in something like the so-called Condition of England novel, Gaskell's North and South, Dickens' Hard Times, where realism was the instrument with which industry and social problems were anatomized and diagnosed. Number two, convincingly structured worlds. You see, it's not just about the things, the details that I've just mentioned, but it's the way that details are all connected together. In a realist novel, we have to believe in, as it were, the physics of the world, the causality, the cause and effect. The physics of the novel's world has to be as close as possible to the physics that we assume applies in our world. Things have to have a certain consistency. Events have to be more or less likely. Characters have to act in psychologically consistent ways. They have to have motives. And this is partly as a result, we find this psychological acuity, this psychological penetration that the realist novel is often known for. As a side note, this interest in the interconnectedness of a world, of creating a world that seems to be coherent, is also why I think realist novels are so often sociological, so often interested in the way that individual lives are shaped by social forces. Because if you're interested in interconnectedness, you're not just going to depict an individual, you're going to depict an individual in terms of their social class, their vocation, their community, their wider social setting. because as John Donne says, no man is an island. Number 3, narrative position. Now, if the realist novel is like a kind of world, then the realist narrator is like a kind of god. You're probably already familiar with the term omniscient narration or all-seeing narration, and it's certainly true that the realist novel did tend towards adopting a narration that was omniscient and overarching. It's what critics might call a meta-discourse or a meta-language. It's an authoritative perspective. Now, in a novel, there are lots of perspectives. Every character has a perspective, every character has a voice, every character has a dialogue. And as the critic Mikhail Bakhtin, pointed out, novels are many-voiced as opposed to, say, lyric poetry, which arguably is one-voiced, it's monologic. Nevertheless, even though there's many perspectives and many voices and many discourses in a novel, we can generally, in the realist novel at least, go to the narrator, the narrative position, to organise all these perspectives into one. The narrative position is the one we go to for its authority. It will interpret, it will judge, it will organise, it will lay out all the other perspectives in the novel, and it will synthesise them into one meta language or meta discourse. A particular kind of twist on this is the frequent use of free indirect discourse, which is where the narrative voice drops into the head of a character, the internal world of a character, and the language of the narration sort of blurs, slightly mixes with the language of the internal thought processes of the character. And this is another way that the realist novel manages to capture the psychological depth of its characters, because the omniscient narrator who knows all corners of his or her world and can go anywhere and judge authoritatively anything, frequently he or she will drop into the heads of characters and give us a totalizing sense of the psychological worlds of all the characters or all the important characters in the novel. Number 4, effacement of style. Now, this kind of goes back to this idea that we don't want to know we're reading a novel. We want to feel we're immersed directly in an objective world. If we as readers feel we're being led through a kind of artificial or a contrived plot, then that realist illusion will be broken. And therefore a lot of the technique in writing realist fiction is to disguise technique, to pretend that there's no mediation, to say that this isn't a work of art, this isn't a construction, even though of course it is, and to pretend that what the novel is referring to, i.e. this fictitious world, to imagine we are directly in that world. So they will generally try and maintain their plots at quite a low, subtle level. They won't try to create artificial, or they will try not to evoke artificial or contrived plots. They will often define themselves as having a kind of non-genre. A lot of realist novels will include a kind of condemnation or critique of romance novels, because romance novels have these exaggerated plots, these very fixed conventions, and what implicitly is being said is that the romance novel is artificial, it has conventions, it has contrived plots, whereas of course now we're in this realist novel, there are no conventions, there are no plots, it just is. It is like the real world is. What's particularly interesting here is the problems of beginnings and endings for the realist novel, because inevitably when it begins and when it closes, the novel has to kind of confess that it is a novel. That illusion of being immersed in a world is slightly broken. And so realist novels always have problems, if you will, beginning and ending, entering the world and exiting the world that are so convincingly creating. And so often you'll get a very limited palette of endings, things like marriage and death would be the two obvious ones, which enable the realist novelist to bring his or her world to a close in the most subtle, the most elegant way possible, with doing the least damage to the realist illusion that he or she has created throughout the novel. 5, finally, and it's a version of that last point, effacement of language. I talked a little bit earlier about the transcription element, the idea of a realist novel be a kind of scientific lens or scientific observation of a world. Realism generally depends on language being as transparent as possible and as little literariness intervening in the language as possible. So things like figures or metaphors or symbols will tend to be subtle. A realist novelist will often go to a figure called metonymy rather than metaphor, because it's subtler, it's less obvious. Certainly what we don't want, or what we don't tend to want in a realist novel, is to get hung up on the idea of language as something that is shaping or mediating the world, because we just want to be immersed directly in that fictitious world. We want language to be as, if you will, transparent or thin or as non-noticeable as possible, even though, of course, what we're reading is a linguistic artifact. And we can see that's a huge difference to, say, modernist fiction, one of the central problems of which, or concerns of which, is the mediation of the world by precisely language. And I think it's really important to remember those last 2 points, the effacement of style and the effacement of language, because realism, if anything, is an anti-technique, an anti-style. It's a technique trying to disguise its own construction. It's a style trying to disguise itself and saying it's not a style, it's just what is, as if it is a world rather than a literary object. And for me, some of the most interesting points in realism are precisely when this comes to the surface, this disguised style, this disguised technicality, when, for example, a realist novel confronts the problem of language mediating the world, or when a realist novel confronts the problem of structuring narrative, of the problem of an ending, for example. So, 5 things to take into consideration whenever you're reading a classic realist text: the piling up of empirical detail, the creation of a seamless physics, a convincingly structured world, the use of narrative position, usually omniscient, and the effacement of style, of technique, and the effacement of language. And if you bring all of those things together into your reading of any realist novel, you'll more than likely, hopefully, come out with a richer understanding of that text. Thanks a lot.